In anticipation of school facility closures or modified operations in the coming school year, the South Carolina Office of Special Education Services convened the Special Education COVID-19 stakeholder group to focus on providing guidance that is intended to ensure that school systems are prepared to serve students with disabilities along with all students for the 2020-2021 academic year. Ensuring compliance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act should not prevent any school from offering educational programs during and after the pandemic. School districts still must provide students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education as required by the IDEA. The COVID-19 stakeholder group includes representatives from the South Carolina Advisory Council for Educating Students with Disabilities, Clemson University, Family Connection of South Carolina, Protection and Advocacy for People with Disabilities, Transition Alliance of South Carolina Partnerships for Inclusion, South Carolina Council for Exceptional Children's Council for Administrators of Special Education, and the University of South Carolina. South Carolina school districts represented on the COVID-19 stakeholder group include Edgefield, Florence 2, Florence 3, Florence 4, Horry County, Lexington 2, Newberry County, Richland 1, and Williamsburg County. Our purpose is to ensure that students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Special Education COVID-19 Stakeholder Group, convened by the South Carolina of Special Education Services, is providing guidance regarding the services and funding that are intended to safeguard the quality and consistency of future instruction and access to continuous learning. To this end, our purpose is first to provide basic information on schools' obligation to provide a FAPE. Second, to give information on the flexibility school districts have in the provision of FAPE. 3, to provide definition and examples of appropriate programming for youngsters with disabilities. 4, convey the responsibilities of IEP teams. And 5, to give examples of useful resources during the time of the pandemic. To date, school districts should have communicated with parents or adult students on how general education curriculum and instruction would be delivered during school closures and how special education and related services are to be delivered during school closures to the extent possible. To provide contact information directing parents to where they could report any concerns or questions. The Oses suggested the use of prior written notice as a method to provide this communication, but did not require COVID-related changes to the IEP. Because all school districts have continued to provide educational opportunities to general education students, districts must ensure that students with disabilities have equal access to the same opportunities, including the provision of FAPE under the IDEA, as well as services and accommodations. Students with a disability, to the greatest extent possible, must be provided the special education and related services that are identified in the student's Individualized Education Program, or IEP. A main purpose of the IDEA is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Now, special education means specially designed instruction that meets the unique needs of the student. Specially designed instruction means adapting the content, methodology, or instructional delivery to address the unique needs of students with disabilities that result from the disabilities and to continue to ensure the students' access to the general curriculum so they can meet educational standards that apply to all students. What the specially designed instruction to meet a student's unique needs and enable them to access the general education curriculum what it looks like may be substantially different during the COVID-19 pandemic. Officials in the United States Department of Education asserted that school districts must provide a free and appropriate public education consistent with the need to protect the health and safety of students with disabilities and those individuals who provide education, specialized instruction, and related services to these students. The guidance from the department indicated that these exceptional circumstances may affect how all education and related services and supports are provided, and the department would offer flexibility when possible. The department also recognized that the use of distance and online instruction to provide special education and related services may be necessary to protect the health and safety of administrators, teachers, and students. Additionally, disability-related modifications and services may be provided, such as distance instruction, teletherapy and teleintervention, extensions of time for assignments, videos with accurate captioning or embedded sign language interpreting, accessible reading materials, and speech and language services provided through video conferencing. Officials in the department also stated that IEP teams must make an individualized determination as to what extent compensatory services may be needed when schools resume normal operations. The guidance the department issued suggested that the officials in the department understand that it may not be feasible for schools to provide all of the same services as they did before the COVID-19 pandemic, and urge that educators and parents collaborate in determining how services will be provided. The department confirmed that existing special education law provides room for flexibility in how schools can meet the needs of students even during the pandemic. Convening the IEP team meetings or IEP reviews in the time of COVID-19 certainly will be a challenge. The idea does allow a student's IEP meeting to be held through alternative means, such as virtual meetings, if parents and school personnel agree to this. It is important that confidentiality be maintained in such meetings as required by the IDEA and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA. There are several terms and definitions IEP teams will need to familiarize themselves with in light of the extended school closures and as districts return to providing instruction this coming year. We will begin taking a look at a term very familiar to IEP teams, Extended School Year Services, or ESY. ESY services are services that are provided to identify students in order to address maintenance of previously acquired skills. ESY services are not typically directed at teaching new skills or to catch students up to grade level. In determining a student's needs for ESY, the IEP team will review data from the previous IEP. In this review, the team will make and analyze this data to determine if the student is subject to substantial regression and lack of recoupment issues during breaks in service. The team will also analyze data to determine if there's evidence that the student is at a place of demonstrating emerging or breakthrough skills. ESY determinations made following the spring 2020 extended school closures should be made using data prior to the closure. The impact of the COVID-19 extended school closure should not be the sole factor considered in determining ESY for students with disabilities. Unlike the term ESY, Supplementary School Closure Services, SSCS, is a term IEP teams may not be as familiar with. Supplementary School Closure Services is a term being used by the South Carolina Department of Education, Office of Special Education Services, in relationship to services students may need related to extended learning change to the instructional environment. Determining a student's need for supplemental school closure services, IEP teams will need to begin to gather data upon reopening of schools. They will then use this data to analyze where the student is performing in relationship to where the student was performing at the onset of the spring 2020 extended school year or extended school closure. This analysis will assist teams in determining what services the student may need moving forward. To begin this analysis of needs, IEP teams will also need to consider how general education students access services during the school closure. Teams will then need to examine if the student with a disability received a contingency service that allowed for the same access as was provided to the student without a disability. Keep in mind, just as students without disabilities did not receive instruction during the extended closure in the same manner as were provided prior to the closure, these contingency IEP services will have likely been a different version of the services indicated in their IEP. Determining the needs for supplemental school closure services will also require that IEP teams compare the impact of the school closure on students with disabilities to students without disabilities. In making this comparison, if the data collected shows a similar impact to that of general education peers, supplemental school closure services may not need to be provided. Let's take a look at some examples of how teams might go about analyzing information and data relevant to the need for supplementary school closure services. In this example, a student's IEP at the time of the extended school closure indicated that the student was to receive 60 minutes a day of specialized instruction in reading inside of the special education classroom. Now, during the extended school closure, the student received virtual assignments 2 times weekly from the special education teacher in addition to the general education assignment and instruction. Once data has been collected to assess the impact of the closure for all students, the provider will need to analyze the student's performance level prior to the closure, compare to the student's current level of performance, and then compare these two to the same data points for all students. If the data indicates that the student with a disability experienced an impact beyond that of what a student without a disability experienced, that student may be in need of supplemental school closure services. In this example, the student's IEP includes services in the area of speech and language for 60 minutes a week in a small group setting. During the extended school closure, the student received a weekly learning packet and weekly phone or virtual contact from the speech provider. Using progress data collected upon his or her return to school, we must consider the impact of the extended school closure for all students and determine the extent to which supplemental services may be needed for the student with a disability. In this example, we see that contingency services were offered to the student through contact by the special education provider to the parent, and that those services were declined. Although declined, the special education provider continued to contact the student and the family in order to provide the services. Again, consider the impact of the school closure for all students, and then determine the need for supplemental services potentially needed for the student. This would not be a case of consideration of compensatory services, which we will cover on the next few slides, as the parent declined the services. Compensatory services is a term somewhat familiar to IEP teams. Compensatory services are typically services awarded to a student through some means of dispute resolution due to an LEA's failure to provide FAPE under the IDEA. Compensatory services are are determined on a case-by-case basis when FAPE has been denied. When there's a determination that the failure of the LEA to provide something results in the denial of a FAPE, the provision of the compensatory services should be intended to put the student back in the position the student would have been had FAPE been provided. It may be that many services for students with disabilities were not provided exactly as written into their IEP during the extended closure. However, this does not result in an automatic consideration for compensatory services. With regard to the consideration of compensatory services in light of the extended school closure, IEP teams must consider whether or not students were provided access to the same instruction as their non-disabled peers received. If the student with a disability was not provided access to the same instruction, the student's IEP will need to convene to consider whether or not the student was denied a FAPE and what the compensatory services, if needed, may be. So, for example, the team would ask, was the student provided access to the same instruction that non-disabled students received? If yes, the student was able to access instruction delivered during their closure and their progress was affected in the same manner as students without disabilities? Then you discuss supplementary services if appropriate. However, if the answer was no, the format of instruction was not accessible to the student and the student did not make progress, then you will need to discuss compensatory services in these needed areas. Another example, during the extended school closure, a student received his services in reading, but did not receive his services in speech. The IEP team will need to determine if the student needs compensatory speech services. Based on student progress in reading, the student may qualify for supplemental services, but not compensatory services. There will also be instances where services within a student's IEP may not have been necessary during the extended school closure. For example, transportation would not have been necessary during the closure. Also, behavior supports for transitioning would not have been necessary during the closure. In these cases, compensatory services would not be a consideration by IEP teams. School closures during COVID-19 have left all school staff and parents scrambling to figure out how to best support children and youth with disabilities. One key aspect that we must remember is that all students were affected by school building closures. When determining services for the 2020-2021 school year, including additional supports such as compensatory education, the first question we should ask is what was provided to all students, regardless of their abilities or disabilities. That can then be used as a foundation for determining what additional services are needed. There are a couple of additional key strategies that should be used when identifying needed supports and services for the coming year. First, communicate early, clearly, and often with parents. It is critical for teachers to create and maintain an open line of communication with parents. Partnering with parents is critical to the success of any model. Reassure your parents that services will be provided to the extent practical and reasonable given the circumstances. This could be communicated by a variety of ways, including written correspondence. Collect data and schedule IEP meetings for your students. Set parents at ease by clearly stating your commitment to meeting their students' needs and serving their child in the best way possible. Be open and honest about what's working and what needs to be adjusted. Acknowledging solidarity and a shared commitment to providing a free, appropriate public education, even during these times of uncertainty, will go a long way toward building the kind of relationship that continues to support students with disabilities now and in the future. There are a number of considerations that special education teachers need to take into account in preparation for and during the coming school year. As stated on the previous slide, IEP teams should meet promptly to achieve 3 goals. First, determine the performance of the student prior to school closure. Second, review the student's current performance. And third, determining the appropriate services that are necessary moving forward. Based on the data and information discussed, the IEP team will need to determine whether there are any needs for supplementary school closure services and/or compensatory services. The IEP team must take into account the effect of the COVID-19 school closure for all students to determine the relative effect for a student with disabilities when considering supplementary school closure services. Special ed services are not intended to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Therefore, the impact for all students must be considered first. If no services were provided or the student did not receive FAPE, compensatory services should be considered. Compensatory services need to be individualized to each student. The team, therefore, must consider how the student was impacted by the denial of FAPE and how the student is expected to respond to compensatory services. Some students will demonstrate an impact consistent with all students from the extended school closure and therefore not require compensatory services. So we must schedule IEP meetings for our students. The following questions should be answered in preparation for the meetings. What instruction was delivered to all same grade students during the closure? How was learning been measured for all students during the closure? What services was the student provided during the closure? And what was the student's progress toward IEP goals prior to school closure? What was the student's progress toward IEP goals upon returning to school? What did the trend in progress monitoring show before and after the school closure? How does the data compare? If expected progress wasn't made, what services are needed? If no services were provided or the student did not FAPE, compensatory services should be considered. There are many excellent resources available to administrators and teachers of students with disabilities. One that we'd like to talk about briefly is the United States Department of Education's homepage on COVID-19. One excellent resource is the U.S. Department of Education's COVID-19 information and resources page. It has excellent information on COVID-19, what we may do in schools. It also has a lot of good information on the IDEA in COVID-19 as well as Department of Education resources. Another good resource also from the U.S. Department of Education is the Individuals with Disabilities Education IDEA website. This website also has some excellent information. This particular one is a supplementary fact sheet. The Office of Special Education programs issued on addressing the risk of COVID-19 with special education students. It has a fact sheet that contains much of the information we've talked about today and other really good pieces of information on how we can react to COVID-19. A third resource is the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services COVID-19 webpage. The Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services, or OSERS, is a department within the U.S. Department of Education. An example on this page is the section called Reflecting Toward Success, Remote Education and Supporting Elementary and Secondary Students with Disabilities During the COVID-19 Panic. The U.S. Department of Education also funds a number of national centers across the United States, many of which have come together to provide resources for educators in these times. The U.S. Department of Education National Center for Systemic Improvement is kind of a clearinghouse for many different practices related to COVID-19 policies in schools, and it contains links to COVID-19 policy guidance on distance learning, telepractice, teletherapy, writing IEPs, and maintaining FAPE during the COVID-19 times. And there are quite a few really good resources. For instance, using sample lessons. It has a frequently asked questions on gathering progress monitoring data virtually, a family guide to home learning, state-to-state links to COVID-19 guidance and plans. Quite a bit of very useful information is available on the National Center for Systemic Improvement. The Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, within the U.S. Department of Education, maintains an excellent Ideas That Work COVID-19 webinar series that is ongoing, and these webinars that were conducted can be accessed on the site, and it has information about this webinars to be conducted. This OSEP-funded website is called the Continuity of Learning During COVID-19. It has some welcome information and then the 3-part webinar series on continuity of learning and returning to school, and can be accessed from this website. And it also has some excellent information in each of these webinars for administrators and teachers of students with disabilities. In conclusion, personnel at the South Carolina Office of Special Education Services strongly believe in the ability of our state's special education administrators and teachers to overcome any obstacles in providing a FAPE to their students, including the obstacle of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Office of Special Education Services stands ready to provide any assistance that you may need.